I need to practice talking like Risman, because I haven't done it in a while. You know, it's been like over a week since I've done a recording. And the house keeps creaking, and also Canada is on fire, and that has made my throat just a little bit scratchy, so we're going to see how this goes. And don't even get me started on the neighbors revving the engines. Just like that. I was gonna cut that part out, but now I think I'll leave it. Okay. Oh no, is that my house? Are they mowing my lawn? Welcome to Forsaken by Shadows, a production of stories by Sarah Danielle. By way of opening announcements, I want to remind you that we now have a Discord server, and we'd love to have you join us for all things creative, spiritual, and fun. You can find the link in the show notes. Previously, on Forsaken by Shadows, from Risman's point of view. Walking Mazira home from her blue light lessons is a ritual set in stone, and after the cycle I've been having, I can't wait to see her and forget about everything else. So I'm not very cautious when I approach the room I've been told she's waiting in. Not like I should have been, knowing that she's recently begun practicing more dangerous forms of offensive magic. When I step into the room, I'm nearly roasted with sacred light, having accidentally startled Mazira by bursting in. But I recover quickly, hiding my shock and embarrassment and praising her instead. It's the first time she succeeded in using Guiding Bolt, and I don't want her to lose her confidence just because I'm an idiot. My enthusiasm only continues, because I have cracked ribs, and I'm just drow enough to use my pain to my advantage. My chest might be throbbing, but now I'm with Mazira, and Mazira knows healing magic. Magic that requires physical contact to work, and I have it all planned out. But I'm thwarted once again, as Mazira has learned a new healing song, one that doesn't require her to touch me. She heals me from a distance, and after overcoming my deep disappointment that I missed out on having her hands on my chest, I praise her again. And that's when I realize she's having a gray day. A day where physical touch and proximity make her skin crawl. It's a roll of the dice when the affliction hits her, but I should have guessed after her dream terrors. An awkward moment comes and goes, where I'm forced to make a temporary alliance with that beast of a cat to soothe her distress. Then the time comes for us to return home for the mid-cycle meal, where I plan to divert her and take her to the garden caverns and make my feelings known. I'm still trying to work out a casual way to ask her for the walk, when she gives me the opportunity herself. It seems the anniversary of her homecoming has been fresh on her mind too, and she was hoping we'd do something special. Our conversation is interrupted by Sabrina, the younger daughter of Torafane and Saria, who's come to invite us to her house to meet her brother. You know, the brother that stole my spot on the patrol. A second later, that very same brother appears, and I'm forced to interact with him again. This time, however, the interaction goes better. Arden sends the girls ahead, and we talk, and I learn he's hoping to only be in the city as long as the fleet is in port. I might be getting my chance on the patrol sooner than we think. We make amends, and I think I may have just made a friend. Then we join the others outside the temple, where Arden's mother and surface friends wait, including that awful Valen Riverton. I tried to ignore him, making my excuses to Saria for Mazira and I to miss out on lunch, but the Sun Elf refuses to be ignored. Instead, he barges into our conversation, and the worst turn of fortune my life could ever take plays out before my very eyes. Valen and Mazira know each other, and as Mazira realizes it, she collapses from the shock. Forsaken by Shadows, Part 3. Where Shadows Linger. Chapter 6. Reunion. Mazira. Mazira woke to the sound of voices arguing somewhere above her head, feeling as though she was stuffed full of Solaran's cotton roving. Please, give us some space. Valen, maybe you should step back too. That was Saria, but this must be a dream. Mazira hadn't heard the name Valen spoken in 18 years. I'm not going anywhere. She's my family. The new speaker sounded familiar, his words and cadence tickling the memories on the edge of her consciousness, but she couldn't quite recall who he was. Family? You're the reason this happened, so back off. And there was Risman, his growl much nearer to her than the others. It must be his strong arms cradled around her, supporting her head and shoulders as she... What? Lay on the ground? Why was she on the ground? And why was everyone speaking in Elvish? What had happened? I didn't do this, snarled the familiar yet unfamiliar voice. You expect me to believe that after that stunt in the pit? That's not... It doesn't... Tuohata doesn't work like that. Gentlemen? Saria's calmly spoken words sliced through the argument, silencing both. If you insist on having this discussion, I will insist you join my children, over there. Risman said nothing, but his teeth clicked together as though he snapped his jaw shut. Something soft and warm touched her face. A hand, Mazira realized, her eyes fluttering open and skin pebbling at the fresh contact. Saria knelt before her, far too close, with another by her side. Now that she was fully aware of him, Risman's arms around her shoulders were just as appalling. Mazira sucked in a sharp breath, trying to bolt up, but Risman's hold was too strong. The concern in Saria's hazel eyes morphed into relief when Mazira's own gaze locked on her, and she drew her hand back. Mazira, darling, stay calm. You fainted. What? Mazira blinked, feeling anything but calm with so many people surrounding her on a gray day. Her eyes shifted from Saria to the stranger, and she froze as memories came flooding back. The stranger, who was not a stranger. The elf who insisted he knew her, and proved himself right in the end. Mazira forgot all about her gray day. She forgot about the hands encircling her, the contact which made her shudder, and everything that had happened before she discovered Valen Rivertone was still alive. Tears welled in her eyes, and this time, when she wrenched herself upright, Risman didn't hold her back. She flung herself into the waiting arms of her childhood friend. Valen! She sobbed, her throat hitching. It's really you! How is this possible? I thought you were dead! Valen was laughing, the same laugh she remembered from her childhood, only richer, deeper. The voice of a man, not the child he'd been when she last saw him. I could ask you the same thing. My gods, Mazira, what are you doing here? Saria cleared her throat, and Mazira suddenly remembered they had an audience. She pulled back, her face flushing. She and Valen were still kneeling, but Saria and Risman had risen to their feet. And of course, at this time in the cycle, the temple was full of people. Songblades and citizens, Saria's children and their friends, and all of Elistrea's cats. There were far too many eyes turned in her direction. Her blush spread from her cheeks to the tips of her fingers as she hastily got to her feet. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to make a scene. You have nothing to apologize for, dear, Saria said. But perhaps we ought to step back into the temple. I'm gathering from the context that this is a momentous occasion. Momentous? Valen echoed. He was still staring at Mazira with wide-eyed astonishment, as if she might vanish if he looked away. Momentous doesn't even begin to cover it. As was her habit, Mazira glanced at Risman. eager to share the joy of the moment with their favorite person, and was taken aback by the darkness in his eyes. He had stepped back into the shadows, as stiff and rigid as the columns around them. Her smile faltered, and she looked away, feeling guilt for reasons she couldn't explain. "Let's go inside," she said, trying to pretend Risman's stone expression hadn't bothered her. But before she could move, Risman spoke. "Are you sure that's a good idea?" His voice was soft but hard, like gravel sliding down a hill. Mizira tensed. "What do you mean?" He took a tentative step toward her, eyes glinting as the white light shone on them directly. "You just fainted. Perhaps I should take you home, have Salarin look at you, just in case." He cast a sideways glance at Valen, and a muscle spasmed in his jaw. "Nonsense," Mizira said, a little more cheerfully than she felt. She was embarrassed enough about her little blackout spell without Risman making a fuss over it. "I was only shocked. Risman, this is Valen. We were children together before... She couldn't finish the rest, but she needed Risman to understand what this meant to her. "I thought he was... gone, like the others." The hardness in Risman's face softened, but it was replaced by what looked like grief. He nodded, arms crossed, and said, "I'll stay with you." "That won't be necessary," Valen cut in, and the coldness in his tone caught Mizira off guard. "I'm not sure if you heard her properly, but we have a lot to discuss. Mistress Saria, I must apologize, but I must beg your release from our established plans. This takes precedence." "Discuss what you want," Risman hissed, before Saria could acknowledge what was said to her. "But I'm not leaving Mizira. We have nothing to discuss that involves you." Risman's fingers twitched, as though he wanted to reach for a weapon or ball his hands into a fist. Whatever his intent, Mizira darted to him, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Dread gnawed at the back of her skull with the contact, but her fear of escalating violence was stronger than her fear of touch. "Risman, it's okay," she said in a low voice. Even with the lingering effects of her gray day returning, her heart fluttered, taking note of his scent and warmth despite the more important matters at hand. The tension in Risman ebbed, and he glanced at her hand, then met her gaze. Then he glanced at Valen, before taking her hand and pulling her further away. Valen's face contorted with fury, and he started to follow, but Saria reached out to stop him. "I don't trust him, Zira," Risman muttered, with another wary look in Valen's direction. "He's the one I told you about, the one who has a problem with Drow." "Well, I can't imagine why," she said dryly, thinking of their mutual misery. She regretted her words instantly when pain lanced across Risman's expression. "I'm sorry," she said, taking his hands in her own, struggling to suppress the unease the proximity roused in her. But while she desired space, Risman required closeness. She could set aside her discomfort for a moment to offer consolation to him. "I didn't mean it like that." She rubbed her thumbs over the back of his hands, attempting to soothe his distress away. "It's not right for him to hold the sins of others against you. But he's new here. He likely hasn't learned it yet. I needed time to learn too, remember?" "Then he's dangerous and you shouldn't be alone with him." Mizira winced. He had a point. Being alone with new, untested voices was considered unwise. Recovery could be violent. But he wasn't a stranger unknown to her. He was Valen. And if he was already testing for the militia, then that meant the Council and Mother Lara had already approved of him. "We won't be alone. I'll take him into the chapel, where we can speak privately, but in the open. I'll be careful, Risman. I'll be safe." "I'll wait with you." "No!" Again, the hurt, when her word came out sharper than she meant. Mizira took a breath, willing him to understand. "Risman, He's the closest thing to family I have left. Which was precisely the wrong thing to say. Risman went from distress to distraught. You know what I mean, she said hurriedly, though she wasn't sure if she knew what she meant. All these years I thought I was alone, the sole survivor of it. And all of a sudden someone else appears. Someone else survived. What if there were others? What if my father... She cut off, her eyes burning with unshed tears. It wasn't a hope she'd ever voiced aloud, not to anyone. In her wildest dreams, she used to fantasize that her father had escaped, that he wasn't really dead. She'd never seen his body, after all. But she'd always told herself it was impossible. No one ever survived a drow raid unless they were meant to, like herself. Until Valen showed up, defying her knowledge of drow cruelty and giving wings to her secret hopes. I need to talk to him, Risman. I have so many questions, so many things I need to understand. Please, I need to do this alone. Why alone? His words were barely a whisper, the very definition of morose. Why can't I be there for you? Mazira didn't have an answer for that. At least, not one he would accept. She couldn't tell him she wanted this moment all to herself, to speak for the first time to someone who truly understood her because he'd actually lived through the same event. Someone who remembered her before the scars, before the servitude, before the pain. Someone who knew what her parents looked like. Risman wouldn't understand, and it would only hurt him more. Being here for me doesn't mean having to be physically here for me, she said finally, hoping it would be enough. Risman shut his eyes, squeezing her hands, before letting her go. You're right. I'm being selfish. I'm sorry. He just... Never mind. It doesn't matter. But I will wait for you nearby. Maybe out here in the gardens? So I can walk you home. After a full cycle of wallowing over how weak and helpless she was tired of being, the reminder of her need for an escort any time she wanted to go somewhere struck just the wrong nerve. It had been a year. A full year. It was time to grow up. I can walk home by myself. She'd meant to sound confident. She only managed catty. Risman's eyes went wide, and it wasn't fair what that look did to her heart. Why was she always doing this to him? Why was she always hurting him? Risman, Mazira started, intending to apologize for the 1,000th time, but he cut her off. No, I'm sorry. He sighed and tilted his head back, staring up at the cavern ceiling. Go talk to him, but be careful, and don't forget your cantata. He glanced back at her, and a shadow of his mischievous grin returned. A knot released in Mazira's heart, even if the reminder of how she'd nearly struck him with her magic made her blush. Yet if he was willing to jest with her, he couldn't be all that hurt. Right? Thank you for understanding, she said, her lips twitching in a smile. I promise it'll be okay. I can't wait to hear about it when you get home, he said, though there was something forced in his cheerfulness. He placed a hand on the small of her back, guiding her toward the others. The touch sent shivers down her spine. The good kind, for once, and she almost changed her mind about wanting him to go. But Valen also sent tingles through her blood. Her heart leapt every time her gaze landed on him, still unable to believe he was actually alive. Even as he glowered at Risman, or rather, the point where Risman's hand disappeared behind her back, she swelled with delight. Let's go inside, she said to him, gesturing for the temple door. Valen gave Risman one last hard look, which the latter returned with a flat stare of his own, before striding to the door with Mazira at his side. As they neared the threshold, Saria offered Risman one more invitation for the mid-cycle meal, which he declined, saying that he wanted to spend the time at home, since it was the anniversary of the novelty of having a home. The words made Mazira stop short. She'd completely forgotten in the shock of Valen materializing from her memories. The anniversary, her secret hope that Risman had planned something for them, his tentative words right before Sabrina interrupted them. Mazira spun, torn between her desire to celebrate special moments with the elf she loved and her desire to reunite with a childhood long gone. But Risman was already at the bottom of the stairs, and Arden had drawn near, speaking to him in a low voice. She considered running to him, to promise she'd make it up to him later in the cycle, to salvage what she could of her hopes, but Valen's hand came down on her shoulder. Is something wrong? The touch of his hand didn't exactly make her shudder, but it wasn't pleasant either. Mazira gently pulled away and turned back into the temple. No, sorry. I just forgot something, but I'll tell him later. She tried to smile, though she couldn't help but feel like she'd missed something incredibly important. Which was ridiculous. She lived with Risman, saw him every cycle. If something needed to be said between them, she could just cross the hall and knock on his door. Valen's gaze trailed after Risman before following her into the vestibule. What is he to you? He asked, his voice tight. Mazira blinked, surprised at his hostility. Then again, Risman had already encountered him, dueled him at least twice, if what she remembered about the descriptions of the test was accurate. He'd reported Valen had problems with dark elves, and really, who could blame him, after what Teloriel had done? Mazira shook the thought away. It was hard not to relive those painful memories, with Valen striding so near. Risman? She began, but got no further. How could she define what Risman was to her? Her dearest, most favorite person, more than a friend, less than a lover. The one who reminded her how to smile, who held back the darkness just enough to keep her from shattering completely. He was everything to her, in a way that was sometimes frightening. He's a friend, she concluded, though the word felt entirely inadequate. He needs to learn how to take a hint, Valen grumbled, as they stepped into the chapel. Mazira winced at his tone, but said nothing. If Valen only knew what they'd been through, if he understood what it had cost Risman to save her, he'd understand why Risman was so protective. It was just another of the traits Mazira adored about him. But something told her now wasn't the time to mention it. Though the temple gardens were full of parishioners, the chapel itself was relatively quiet. As always, a songblade strummed the harp at the feet of Elistrea's idol, and here and there people sat in quiet contemplation or knelt in prayer. A few songblades drifted about, but otherwise, all was as Mazira hoped. She led Valen to a bench near the back and motioned for him to sit. He was only being cautious, she said, as she took her own seat. Valen hesitated, glancing around. Isn't there somewhere more private we can go? Well, yes. There were plenty of private rooms to go to. The temple was massive and served as a community center as much as a house of worship. But she'd promised Risman to stay in the open, and though nothing about Valen made her feel afraid to be behind closed doors with him, she intended to keep her word. We won't be disturbed here. True to Risman's claim, Valen's eye slid right over the surface folk and lingered on the songblades, all of whom were drow, before he finally sat beside her, tense and on edge. I don't get it, he said, his eyes roving in every direction. How can you be so calm with so many of them walking around? Strange how his question stung her heart. A year ago, she wondered the same thing. Now she looked around and saw only sisters, priestesses who taught her magic songs and how to be strong. It hasn't always been easy, she admitted. But the dark elves here, they're not like the ones who... She trailed off, and the look Valen gave her made her wish she'd brought him into a private room after all. His eyes were full of understanding, true knowing, deep compassion. He reached out a hand to take hers, and though everything in Mizira rebelled against the action, she let him. "I can't believe we found each other," he whispered. His hands, like Risman's, were rough and calloused. At least, what little of them she could feel, wrapped in linens as his were. "It's a miracle. Of all the holes to crawl into, I happened to land in yours. But gods, Mizira, what are you doing here? How'd you get here?" Mizira struggled to breathe. Between her touch aversion and the overwhelming realization of his tangible presence, she was reeling. When she could stand it no longer, she pulled her hand back and settled it on her lap, twisting her skirts. "It's as you said, a miracle." She looked up into the stone face of the goddess whose temple they sojourned in. "Though I suppose providence is the more correct term. They say it was Elistrea who brought me here, and I believe it." Valen's eyes narrowed. "Elistrea? Isn't she their god?" "In a way, yes," Mizira conceded. "But her attention is on all those who suffer under the Spider Queen, slaves and citizens alike. She's the goddess of freedom, and her purpose is to set captives free, like me." "Captives?" The color drained from his sun-kissed face. "Wait, you mean you? Captive? Here? All these years?" "Well, yes, of course." His shock surprised her. Why else would she be underground? How else would she have survived? I was taken by the leader of... He took me as his own plunder. If it weren't for Risman, I'd still be his slave, if not dead. We escaped over a year ago, and actually, it's been a year to the day since we arrived here." Valen's hands tightened into fists, his eyes blazing. "A slave," he repeated through clenched teeth. "If I had known, Mizira, I'm so sorry. I would have come for you." He said it with such earnestness that Mizira felt her cheeks grow hot once again. "It's not your fault," she assured him. "And it's over. I'm free now. Risman..." "Always Risman," Valen said, glaring through the walls as if he could see through the stone. Mizira didn't know what to say. She was tempted to ask what had happened between them at the cove to make them dislike each other so much, but she decided to ask Risman later. "But what about you?" she asked, hoping to change the subject. "How did you survive? Did anyone else survive?" At this, Valen's shoulders slumped. "Not as far as I know," he said, then suddenly stiffened. "Wait, I found everyone but you, and your mother. Did she?" Mizira didn't have to say anything. Her somber expression cut off his words. "Oh." "I saw it happen," Mizira said. "He followed us into the forest and killed her, and then he took me because he didn't get to kill anyone else. So I had to make up for it." Valen reached for her hand again, but Mizira turned away. You said you saw everyone?" she managed, though her words shook. "Does that mean you saw... Did my father..." She wasn't looking at him, but his silence was enough. The last of her wildest hopes trickled into dust, and it was like losing him all over again, except different, because this time she was allowed to feel the loss. She really was alone. But no, she wasn't. Valen was here. He was part of her past. He remembered the Rivertones, was the Rivertones. It was his father who banded the troop together, his name which had been painted on the banners of their shows. "I'm sorry, Mizira," Valen said, so soft she almost missed it. Taking a breath, Mizira turned to face him. She willed her hand to reach for his, swallowing bile when his fingers laced in hers. "I'm sorry too," she choked out. And then, despite Risman's worries, she tugged Valen to his feet, led him out of the chapel and into the first empty room she found, and shut the door behind them. The moment the darkness engulfed them, she slid to the floor and wept. It wasn't long before Valen wept with her. "My mother fell on me," Valen said, some unknowable time later. "When she died, I think she did it on purpose." Mizira sat huddled against the back of a sofa. The room she had chosen was arrayed for receiving guests, comfortable and quaint. A silver serving tray rested on the small table, and she'd illuminated it with a hummed melody, unable to bring herself to sing the cantrip's words. Valen had been properly amazed at her sudden talent for the weave, which raised her spirits slightly. He lounged back against a second settee, a proper distance away. He'd tried to put his arms around her when they cried, but it was too much for her gray day to handle. She had pushed him away and, thankfully, he didn't seem offended. Mizira had already told him her story, or at least, the bare bones of it. The leader of the raid had taken her captive, she'd met Risman and befriended him, and then he'd helped her escape. Just like that, her whole life summed up in 3 sentences. Valen had asked for no clarifying details, no episodes of her misery, and she offered none on her own. Now she listened as he told his story. She was run through. His eyes were distant, far away. But she staggered toward me and crushed me to the ground. I was so scared, I didn't move. I think I fainted. I guess they must have thought I was dead, because when I woke, everything was quiet. Now was the part where Mizira was supposed to offer him comfort, but she couldn't do it. She was hurting too much herself, so she just listened. I was sure it was a trick, and that the moment I started to move, they'd come out of hiding and finish me off. I lay there the whole day, feeling my mother's body turn to ice, watching the flies in carrion gather. He fell silent, lifting a hand to his face and biting down on his knuckle. "You don't have to tell me," Mizira offered. "If it's too much." "No," he said. "No, you should know what happened." He fidgeted with the loose locks hanging around his face, much like Mizira did when she was nervous. I lay there the whole day, dreading what night would bring, but near sundown, travelers came by, a merchant caravan. They found the carnage and were good enough to stop. They gave everyone a proper burial. It was amazing how such a small detail, the kindness of strangers nearly 2 decades past, could mean so much to Mizira. She breathed a sigh of relief, grateful the nightmares of her family rotting under the sun were false. Hopefully, someone found her mother, too. Needless to say, they discovered me right away. As soon as they moved my mother's body, I started screaming. One of the merchants had his daughter with him, and she calmed me down and brought me into the wagon while the men worked on the graves. I think I was in shock. I didn't say a word the whole time I was with them. and they had to force me to eat." Mizira remained silent, knowing all too well the shock he spoke of. It had plagued her early days in Menzoberranzan, and by the time she moved past it, there was no time to grieve. "I just felt so guilty. Like it was all my fault. Like I should have grabbed a weapon and fought with my paw." "You were just a boy." "I was old enough to know I was a coward," Valen snapped. "I laid there and hid while everyone else was slaughtered. Why didn't I die too? Why was I alone spared?" His words could have come directly from Mizira's own heart. She'd asked herself the same thing hundreds of times, and even after a year of deep conversations with Salarin and the women of Elistrea's clergy, she'd come no closer to the answer. Everyone had their theories, of course, but all of them felt like bandages on fatal wounds. Salarin's answer was the one she liked best, the one she repeated now. "No one knows the will and way of the gods. Fate is an indiscernible cipher. We can't get caught up in the why, but need to focus on the what now." Valen cracked a smile, though it didn't quite reach his haunted eyes. "Well, look at you. When did you get to be so wise, little Zizzy?" Mizira couldn't help herself. She choked out a laugh. "Oh my gods, I haven't heard that name in so long. You used to throw rocks at me when I called you that." "Only once." "Yeah, because you got me, and I learned to wait until there were no rocks around to tease you. Those stitches hurt." They both laughed this time, and it was real, genuine delight. "Mama wouldn't let me out of the wagon for a whole 10-day, Mizira said when she caught her breath. "I remember," Valen said, "and when she did let you out, I hid in mine." Mizira grinned. She'd had a fight in her once. Spirit and rebellion. And maybe it had never left her. Maybe that's why she managed to stay sane when Teloriel tried to break her. How she managed to keep herself together in a den of misery. She'd always been rebelling, in her own quiet way. At length, Valen sighed. "What now?" he repeated, drumming his fingers on the settee. "I guess that's why I'm here. I'm living out my what now." "What do you mean?" He held up his wrapped hands. "I've been training in a monastery," he explained, as if that answered her question. "Miriam, the merchant's daughter who took me in, would have cared for me the rest of her life if I'd wanted. But the caravan visited a monastery not long after rescuing me, and I saw the monks training." His eyes shone as he recounted the memory. "They were incredible. So much power, just in their bare hands. I wanted to learn to be like that, to never be a coward again, to never lose anyone again. So I stayed, and they took me in." Mizira thought of the cantata of Guiding Bolt in her stack of sheet music, and understood his sentiment completely. "I've been training this whole time to do something about what happened. And then, 6 months ago, we met your fleet, and I realized this was my opportunity. I came here to save people from drow. I just didn't realize how many drow would be here." Mizira blinked, not sure at first if he was being serious. Of course, she'd never met the members of the fleet before, save for Arden just now, but it was her understanding that the majority of the members were drow. Dark elves on a mission for Elistrea, endeavoring to spread the word that there were dark elves in the world who didn't ascribe to Lolth's wicked ways. Valen must have read her confusion, for he said, "I mean, there were drow on the ships, but it was different up there. We were in port most of the time, and they seemed so far and few between. But here, underground, in their territory..." He shuddered. "Valen, you know the Dark Elves here are good, right?" Yes, I've been told," he said, waving a flippant hand. And I like Arden, despite half his heritage. If this was how he'd behaved at the Cove, she understood why Risman had been so against him. She took a breath, wondering what, if anything, she could say. Maybe she ought to introduce him to Tiana. No one could hate Tiana, even without her ethereal charm. Wait a minute, Valen said suddenly, sitting up straight. You were taken captive by the raid leader. Yes? So then you know. Mazira frowned. Know what? You know who's responsible for the murder of our family. He was on his knees, staring down at her with an eagerness that made her flinch. It's not something I'm excited about, she said cautiously. Coralon has blessed my purpose, Valen exclaimed. Mazira, I didn't just come here to save others. I came here to get vengeance for our people. I thought it would take my whole life, but here you are. You can take me right to the bastards responsible. Mazira was staring now, her mouth agape. You want me to lead you to House Tyr? She repeated, trying to wrap her head around what he was asking. The effect of the statement was not what she expected. Valen's growing elation morphed into vile hate. Tyr? He repeated. As in, Risman Tyr? His outburst didn't make sense. Well, kind of. I told you, I met him when we were children. Where did you think I met him? I don't know, Valen said, and his wrath became frightening. I don't know how drow slavery works. You didn't tell me he was part of the family that killed our family. Too late, Mazira realized the implications of her words. She jumped to her feet at the same moment Valen did. He made for the door, but she beat him to it, breaking out in a cold sweat as her hand spread across his chest, halting him in place. Valen, wait! Let me explain! You said he rescued you! Your abuser can't also be your savior! He didn't abuse me! She cried, desperate. Well, at least not on purpose, the way his siblings had. His cruelties were accidents because he didn't know better, and he'd apologized and made up for every one of them. Valen, we were the same age. He was treated just as poorly as me. We were friends in secret, bonded by our mutual misery. Risman has never harmed me. Well, except for that one time, but he regretted it and she forgave him. He has only been good to me. Valen glared down at her, fuming, and Mazira took his silence as evidence he was listening. He got that scar on his face from his brother, Teloriel, the one who led the raid. He got it because he came between Teloriel and me, to save me from him. He's good, Valen. He's so good. He had nothing to do with the raid, and he's renounced everything from his old life. Are you sure about that? He seemed rather proud of it earlier. Mazira's shoulders sagged, and something in her expression must have pricked his anger, for his eyes widened and he took a step back. I'm sorry, he said, and he truly sounded repentant. It's just, my whole life I've been hunting their murderers, and now I know the name and someone with the name. I overreacted. I'm sorry. If you say he's good, I believe you. Mazira breathed a heavy sigh of relief, slumping back against the door. It's all right, she said. I understand. It took me a while, too, to adjust. She thought of Tiana again, and how the girl had helped her overcome her fear of others, and of Solarin, with his kind hospitality and wisdom, teaching her to run a business and empowering her to stay free all the days of her life. Why don't you come over, she said, hoping to change the subject. Have supper with my family, that is, my adopted family, and get to know them. Maybe not today. I think Solarin has planned something special for the cycle, since it's our anniversary and all. But perhaps tomorrow? I can ask. Valen's expression was carefully neutral. Your family, he said slowly. They're all drow? Mazira held her breath and nodded. Valen regarded her for a long moment before suddenly breaking into a smile. I'd like that. It's weird to think about, drow and family in a sentence together, but this is a weird place, I'm told. I need to set aside my assumptions and experience it. Mazira released her breath, relaxing. Yes, he could learn, in time, though she chose not to mention that Risman was one of the members of this adopted family he'd be dining with. Let him find that out after he set aside his assumptions and was open to new experiences. Wonderful, she said, fumbling for the doorknob. It was about time to leave this secluded room behind. As a new voice, Valen should be watched at all times, but she wasn't sure they'd applied all the rules to these new surface voices. She'd ask Solarin about it later. After Valen's outburst over Risman's identity, she wasn't sure he should be exempt, much as it pained her to admit it. But actually, she continued, trying to keep her tone light, drow have strong family ties, even the spider-serving ones. She had hoped to change the subject, not flaunt her knowledge, and it seemed to work. Valen followed her without question into the hall. Oh, really? He asked, with genuine interest. Tell me all about it. Thank you for listening to this episode of Forsaken by Shadows, written and produced by me, Sarah Danielle. And thank you to Tabletop Audio and Pixabay for the use of their resources in this production. As always, Forsaken by Shadows is unofficial fan content not endorsed by Wizards of the Coast. Well, I promised you all a soap opera in Season 3, and I hope that I'm delivering. But don't worry, or maybe do worry, because the dead bodies are coming back soon. Make sure you subscribe to follow along and find out what happens next.